On this video, I want to talk about when it comes to actually production, not all of the energy that hits a phototroph actually gets converted into chemical energy. Remember, during the process of photosynthesis, you're trying to trap the energy of the sun to combine carbon dioxide and water into the actual sugar. So what you're doing is that you're using the energy of the sun to power what we call an anabolic reaction, where you're building something. You're building this big molecule called sugar or glucose. So in order to do this, you're going to need a constant input of energy. Because when you're building something, you need to use energy, right? Now, as the sunlight is actually hitting the plant, first of all, the plant doesn't really absorb all of the sunlight. You see that on the graph on the middle and the top. In fact, the plant absorbs most of the red, a little bit of the orange light, and a lot of the blue and the purple light, but very little of the green and yellow spectrum. So that already means that the plant does not absorb most of the energy that is going to be available in the sunlight, because a whole chunk of the energy is not really absorbed. In fact, that light just pretty much goes through the plant. As the light goes through the chloroplast, which is the little organelle that actually performs the photosynthesis, it goes to these little stacks that are doing the photosynthesis, and they're called thylakoids. By the time you get to the end of the stacks, most of the colors have been absorbed, but the green color is not. And that's why the chloroplast will look green, because the energy that hits the chloroplast, most of it gets absorbed except for that. And that happens because the energy that hits these pigments, these little things like chlorophyll, that inside the chloroplast, inside the thylakoids membrane, that absorb different colors of light. You see that on the top left, how different pigments, each will absorb different amounts of light. But notice what's happening there. As each pigment absorbs a little bit of the light, they have to transfer the energy that they absorb to the next pigment. Ultimately, the chlorophyll A is the one that gets all that energy. But remember what we talked about in thermodynamics. Every time an energy transfer takes place, some of the energy is lost as heat. That means that even the energy that actually was absorbed originally, some of that energy will be wasted as heat before the energy actually gets to its final destination, which is the glucose. And in fact, that pigment is only the first step of a series of chemical reactions we learn about when we talk about photosynthesis. And throughout those chemical reactions, the energy will piggyback like a hot potato from molecule to molecule until it finally ends up in glucose. It's a very complex process. It's what we call a biochemical pathway, where a lot of chemical reactions are taking place and energy is being transferred several times. Now, life did this with as few transfers as possible to minimize the amount of energy that's wasted in the process. But still, a lot of the energy that ends up hitting the plant and actually being absorbed by the plant doesn't necessarily get converted into the sugar that's the final product of photosynthesis. What this means is that plants are not 100% efficient at making the sugar. That means from the 100% of the energy that actually hits the plant, which is only a minority of the energy that actually hit the earth, we talked about that, we talked about Earth energy budget in the previous video, only a small fraction of that energy actually ends up in sugar. In fact, it's less than 25% of the energy that actually hits the plant and it's tried to be absorbed by the plant actually end up in the sugar. The rest is wasted as heat. So that's what we call photosynthetic efficiency. It's the idea that plants, algae, cyanobacteria, whatever's trying to do photosynthesis will not be completely efficient at capturing the energy. First, because there are some parts of the light that they don't even capture. Second, because throughout the processes, several different pigments are going to be involved in capturing the energy, and they have to transfer the energy, and that means some of the energy is going to be wasted. Third, because once the final pigment actually gets that energy, that's just the first step of a series of chemical reactions where, again, transfers will cause the energy to be wasted. And then finally, that means that ultimately you're not going to have all of the energy being used. Now, that's not the only rare place where energy is wasted in the producer. In fact, if you think about the fact that some of the energy that the plant actually trapped in that sugar is going to be used up by the plant. Because this plant is going to be growing, this plant is going to be developing, this plant is going to be responding to stimuli, this plant is going to be reproducing. All of these events will require the plant to do cellular respiration, to burn that sugar, the sugar that it created itself, to use energy. Remember that most of the cells of the plant cannot do photosynthesis, and remember that even during the night, the plant gotta keep on living, which means the plant does the same thing you and me do. They break down sugar. The difference is that they can make their own sugar. That means the plants also consume water, also consume carbon dioxide, they also consume oxygen. They do the same things that we do on our daily lives. That means that some of the energy that's produced by the plant, which is what we call gross primary productivity. Gross is the total amount of energy that's produced. So some of the gross primary productivity is actually used up by the plant itself. That is called primary consumption, or the idea that some of the plant is actually going to be using the energy that it itself makes. Alright? Now, that means that the total amount of energy that the plant is actually producing, the extra amount, that is what we're interested in when we're thinking about what the plant actually does. And that's called net primary productivity, which is basically the gross productivity, which is the total amount of sugar or energy that's actually trapped in the sugar, minus the energy that the plant uses through cellular respiration to power its own life. Now, if you think about that at the ecosystem level and realize that there's going to be thousands of plants or thousands of algae or thousands of cyanobacteria doing this, all right, you're going to think about the idea of what is called a standing crop. Now, a standing crop is the total amount of biomass of living photosynthetic organisms in an ecosystem. So that's like, the standing crop. Literally, how many producers and how much mass of producers you have in the ecosystem. Now, when you're talking about productivity, you're talking about the increase in this standing crop. It's not so much about how much mass of producers you have. It's about how much increase in this mass you're going to see. So to measure the productivity in an ecosystem, you have to be looking at how much the biomass of the producer is increasing. Or the idea that if you have a tree, for example, that's been there for a very long time, but it's not growing at all, no new leaves, no nothing, it's not producing anything. Productivity has to do with new matter, new energy being entering the ecosystem. So in that sense, productivity has to do with an increase in the standing crop, not so much in how much you have in that standing crop. And also remember that when you're calculating the biomass, this is a very concept that I didn't talk about before, you must ignore all the water. Because when you look at organisms, the majority of it is made of water, but there's no energy there. The biomass is everything, that makes you who you are, except the water. So it's the dry weight of the organism. That's what we refer to when we're looking at the standing crop, at the dry weight of the organism. So all the weight minus the water weight of the organism. If that's increasing, that means productivity is on the positive side, and that's probably good news for the ecosystem. By the way, though generally people would say that increasing the productivity would also help the ecosystem become more diverse, it's also true that too much productivity might be a problem in two situations. In the water, when there's too much productivity, usually that means there's too many nutrients, and that's usually going to cause something that we call eutrophication, where the growth of producers near the top basically blocks all the sunlight to the bottom, and when those producers die, they sink to the bottom and they start being decomposed, and a lot of carbon dioxide production happens in the bottom of the lake, for example, when all those decomposers are working, and this actually ends up starving the lake for oxygen, and that's actually a bad thing. And likewise, productivity could be a problem if it increases too much. There's so much resources that the competition for those resources might sometimes increase, as animals now have abundancy and they have to start fighting for those new resources that are available. So increases in productivity when they're too high actually tend to hurt the ecosystem. So, slightly high productivity is a good thing, but too much of anything could be a problem.